Leonard Jackson, a man wrongfully convicted, is spending his final days on death row, with only hours left before his execution. Through all the years of trials and appeals, there's one thing he desperately wishes for: to see his loyal companion, Eclipse, one last time. A German shepherd that he loved deeply, Eclipse represents a part of his past, the only piece of happiness left in the cold, dark prison. For 5 long years, Len has maintained his innocence, but no one believed him, even when new evidence was continuously overlooked. In the dim light of his cell, the only hope that remains is the thought of being reunited with Eclipse. But will his final wish be granted? Will the truth come to light before it's too late? Don't miss this emotional journey of justice, love, and the fight for redemption as Leonard Jackson struggles against a system that wrongfully condemned him. It's a story of loss, resilience, and the ultimate hope for freedom, no matter how impossible it seems. Helen Griggs had always believed in Leonard Jackson's innocence, even when the world, including the courts, turned its back on him. For 5 years, she fought tirelessly, trying to clear his name. Their life, once full of love and dreams, was shattered the night Len was arrested, wrongfully convicted of a murder he didn't commit. She never wavered in her faith, holding on to the belief that one day the truth would come out. And through it all, there was Eclipse, the German shepherd they adopted together, a symbol of the life they once had and the hope they both clung to. When the news came that Len's execution was set for the following morning, Helen's heart sank, but she refused to give up. She knew Len's final wish: to see Eclipse one last time. It seemed like an impossible request. Prison regulations were strict, and there was little hope of approval. Yet in the face of injustice, Helen wasn't ready to let the system dictate her last moments with Len. She set off for Ironwood State Prison, determined to fulfill his dying wish, even if it seemed like the world was closing in on them. With only hours to spare, Helen raced against time, feeling the weight of every minute as the clock ticked down. She knew that this could be the last chance to give Len some peace, to give him a glimpse of the unconditional love he'd shared with Eclipse before everything went wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest as she navigated through the prison gates, praying that the warden would show mercy. When she finally stepped into the prison, with Eclipse at her side, she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Then, in a moment of shocking relief, the warden, Mara Batista, walked into the room with the approval they never thought they'd get. With only a short window of time left, Helen led Eclipse into the final holding cell, where Len's tearful eyes met his dog's excited gaze. For a brief moment, the harsh realities of prison life faded away. Eclipse barked in pure joy, tail wagging furiously, as if understanding that this reunion was the last chance for Len to experience the love and loyalty that had kept him going all these years. In that fleeting moment of joy, with tears streaming down his face, Len whispered to Eclipse, "I never stopped loving you, boy. You were my strength when I had nothing left." Eclipse, oblivious to the turmoil, showered Len with affection, his paws pressing gently against the man he had once shared his life with. Helen watched, overwhelmed by the raw emotion, and though the world outside continued its rush toward the inevitable, here in this sterile room, time stood still. As the minutes ticked away, the reality of their situation set in. This was their last moment together. Len, still fighting for justice, clung to the hope that somehow the truth would come to light before it was too late. For Helen, it was the culmination of years of pain and sacrifice. Despite everything, she knew she had done everything she could to save him. This emotional moment, between man and dog, between two people who had shared a life before it was stolen, would soon be interrupted by the grim reality of the execution. Yet there was something more that Helen didn't know. Detective Anton Delocqua, the man who had once helped convict Len, had started to question the integrity of the case. After years of doubts and lingering guilt, Delocqua began his own investigation, piecing together new evidence that could potentially save Len from the lethal injection. But would it be enough? Would the system recognize its mistakes before time ran out? Stay tuned to see if the truth will come to light in the final hours, if the bond between a man and his dog can bring about the justice they both deserve. As Leonard Jackson sat on death row, the hours before his scheduled execution weighed heavily on him. He had fought for 5 years, insisting that he was innocent of the crime he was accused of, but no one seemed to believe him. The conviction was sealed, and the world had turned its back. Yet one final wish remained, a wish to see his loyal German shepherd, Eclipse, one last time before the end. That dog had been his companion, his lifeline through some of the darkest moments of his life. Eclipse had been by his side before the arrest, a reminder of the life he once had, and now perhaps a symbol of the hope he still clung to. In the final days leading up to the execution, Leonard had little to hold on to. The days blurred together in the harsh, fluorescent lights of his cell, and the echoes of footsteps from the guards patrolling the corridors were the only company he had. But there was something else, the quiet, stubborn thread of defiance within him. He refused to die without seeing Eclipse. He knew it was a long shot, a request that seemed impossible to fulfill in a prison so strict about its regulations. But he made his plea to the warden, hoping for a sliver of mercy. Helen Griggs, his fiancée, had never stopped believing in his innocence. Their life together had been torn apart the night Leonard was arrested, and she had spent the years since fighting relentlessly to prove his innocence. She knew that his execution was inevitable unless something drastic happened, but she wasn't willing to give up without a fight. When she learned that Leonard's last wish was to see Eclipse, she knew she had to do everything in her power to make it happen. Helen rushed to Ironwood State Prison, bringing Eclipse with her, hoping against hope that the warden would make an exception. She could feel the weight of every second ticking by, but she kept pushing forward, determined to make one last memory with the love of her life. The moment she arrived at the prison, she felt the familiar coldness of the place. But there was also a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The warden, Mara Batista, met her with an expression of professional detachment. It was clear that bringing an animal into the prison was an extraordinary request, but Helen wouldn't let go of the idea. She fought with everything she had, explaining the deep bond between Leonard and Eclipse and how this final meeting might offer a small moment of peace before the inevitable. To Helen's surprise, the warden relented, offering a brief window of time for the reunion. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Leonard and Eclipse to share one final moment of joy. When the dog entered the cell, the transformation was immediate. Eclipse, recognizing his beloved owner, let out a joyful bark and immediately bounded toward Leonard. The room, so sterile and cold just moments before, seemed to come alive with warmth. Leonard, tears streaming down his face, dropped to his knees, embracing Eclipse in a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion. The dog licked his face, tail wagging furiously, as if to say, "I've waited for you, and now we're together again." For a few precious minutes, the world outside, the protesters, the executioner, and the clock ticking down to Leonard's end all faded away. In those moments, Leonard wasn't a man condemned to die. He was simply a man with his dog, a man who had loved and lost, and was now finding a small piece of redemption in the unwavering loyalty of the animal by his side. But as the reunion ended, reality began to creep back in. The execution was still scheduled, and no one knew if there was any chance to stop it. As the minutes passed, the hope that this final request could lead to something more grew stronger. Could the truth finally be uncovered before it was too late? Could the man who had been wrongfully convicted find a way out of the death sentence that had been imposed on him? Stay tuned to find out if Leonard Jackson's fight for justice is truly over, or if there's still a chance for the truth to come to light. With every passing second, the possibility of redemption, justice, and freedom grows. Will it come in time? Detective Anton Delacroix had spent years believing he had solved the case. He had led the investigation that put Leonard Jackson on death row, convinced that the evidence was airtight. But as the years passed, doubt began to creep into his mind. The whispers from his old partner, the odd inconsistencies in the case, and the overlooked details that never seemed to add up, they all started to gnaw at him. Delacroix, once proud of the conviction, now found himself questioning everything. As Leonard's execution date approached, Delacroix could no longer shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the case. The pieces didn't fit, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the evidence against Leonard was shaky at best. The partial fingerprint on the weapon, the unreliable witness statements, and the missing financial records. The things that had seemed like solid proof now felt more like a carefully constructed web of lies. The more Dell'Acqua dug into the case, the clearer it became that they had gotten it wrong. Dell'Acqua was a man who had always prided himself on justice, on the truth. But now in the quiet hours of the night, he found himself haunted by the faces of the innocent who had been wronged, the people whose lives had been ruined by a flawed system. Leonard Jackson's face had been one of those, and Dell'Acqua could no longer stand by while an innocent man faced death. With the clock ticking down to the execution, Dell'Acqua decided to take a desperate gamble. He reached out to his contacts, asking them to dig into the case once more. He couldn't undo the years of mistakes, but he could at least try to find something, anything that might prove Leonard's innocence. He needed to find the truth, even if it meant risking his career and reputation. His phone call to a digital investigator, a contact he had quietly built over the years, set the wheels in motion. They would retrace every step, every piece of evidence, and see if there was something that had been missed. He knew it was a long shot, but Dell'Acqua wasn't ready to let another man die because of his own failures. Then just hours before the execution, Dell'Acqua got a breakthrough. The investigator had uncovered a series of phone records that linked a new suspect, Walton Green, to the crime scene. Green was a shady figure, a fixer known for his connections to dangerous people, and the evidence suggested he had been in the area the night of Raymond Concade's murder. This discovery, coupled with the suppressed forensic report, sent Dell'Acqua's mind racing. There was a chance, a slim one, that this was enough to stop the execution, but time was running out. As he rushed to the prison, Dell'Acqua felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. This was his chance to do right, to undo the damage he had caused, to make sure that justice prevailed. With every mile, the dread grew. What if it was too late? What if the system wouldn't listen? But as he approached Ironwood State Prison, he found a sliver of hope that for the first time in years, the truth might finally come to light. Inside the prison, the clock continued ticking, but with Dell'Acqua's persistence, there was now a chance for Leonard to be saved. Would the new evidence be enough to stop the execution? Or would it be too little, too late? Stay tuned to find out if Anton Dell'Acqua's gamble pays off and whether justice can be served before the unthinkable happens. Will the truth be enough to stop Leonard's execution, or is it too late for redemption? In the darkest hours before Leonard Jackson's scheduled execution, a twist of fate gave him one final chance at life. After years of legal battles, false accusations, and the looming threat of death, Leonard had almost given up hope. But something unexpected happened. A small thread of possibility emerged in the form of new evidence, a clue that might finally prove his innocence. It all started when Detective Anton Dell'Acqua, the man who had once led the investigation that convicted Leonard, began to question everything. The years had worn away Dell'Acqua's confidence in the case. Details that were once seen as airtight evidence now seemed suspicious, even manipulated. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the system he had trusted might have failed Leonard in the worst possible way. The more he looked into it, the clearer it became that something had been deliberately hidden, something crucial that could save an innocent man from dying. With his conscience eating away at him, Dell'Acqua set out on a mission to uncover the truth. He contacted a trusted source in digital forensics, someone who could dig deep into the case and pull out anything that had been missed or buried. Hours before Leonard's execution, they made a startling discovery. Walton Green, a fixer known for his ties to dangerous figures, had been in the area the night Raymond Concade was murdered. Green's name had never come up during the trial, but now it seemed to tie directly to the crime. Dell'Acqua, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, realized this could be the key to halting the execution. But time was running out. Leonard was scheduled to die within hours, and Dell'Acqua had to act fast. He reached out to the prison, urging them to stop everything and give him just a moment more to verify the new evidence. But with each passing second, the grim reality set in. What if it was too late? What if the system, so set in its ways, wouldn't allow this new information to change anything? Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, raced against time herself. She had always believed in his innocence, fighting for him even when the world turned its back. But now, in the shadow of his execution, She was beginning to fear that their final chance was slipping away. She fought tooth and nail to get the warden's approval to allow Leonard to see Eclipse, the German shepherd they had adopted together, one last time. She knew that even if Leonard could die, at least he deserved this final moment of peace, a small memory of a life before everything went wrong. As the clock ticked down, the air inside Ironwood Prison grew tense. Delacroix was making his case to anyone who would listen, trying to push the new evidence through the system. With each passing minute, the fear that they might be too late crept closer. But then, as if a miracle had happened, they got the word. The execution was postponed for just 2 hours. The warden had agreed to give Delacroix and the investigators time to verify the new evidence, giving Leonard a glimmer of hope when all seemed lost. In the final moments, Leonard stood in his cell, uncertain of what would come next. His fate was still in the balance, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a spark of hope. Was this the moment when justice would finally be served? Stay tuned as the battle for Leonard Jackson's life unfolds in a race against time, where every second counts, and the fight for truth could change everything. Will the new evidence save him, or will the clock run out before justice can be served? As Leonard Jackson's execution loomed ever closer, a flicker of hope emerged in the most unexpected way. For years, Leonard had been trapped in a nightmare, wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit, sentenced to death, and left to wait in a cold, isolated cell. He had fought relentlessly to prove his innocence, but despite his best efforts, no one had listened. Now, with the clock ticking down to his final moments, he faced the reality that he might never get the chance to clear his name. However, on the eve of his execution, something shifted in the shadows. Detective Anton Delacroix, the very man who had led the investigation that put Leonard on death row, was beginning to unravel the truth. Delacroix had spent years believing in the case, confident that the evidence was irrefutable. But over time, doubts crept into his mind. The more he thought about it, the more the case didn't add up. The witnesses, the supposed fingerprints, the motive, it all seemed too convenient. And then, a small detail, one that had been buried under layers of corruption and neglect, surfaced, threatening to shatter everything. Delacroix's investigation had led him to Walton Green, a known fixer who had connections to dangerous figures in the underworld. Green's name had never been brought up during Leonard's trial, but new evidence showed that he had been in the area on the night of the murder. This revelation was a bombshell, one that could potentially exonerate Leonard and stop the execution. But time was running out, and Delacroix knew he had mere hours to act. He raced against the clock, determined to present this newfound evidence to the authorities. But the wheels of the justice system turned slowly, and the chances of success seemed slim. Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, was not about to give up on him. She had been by his side since the beginning, refusing to believe the lies that had led to his conviction. She knew that the execution was imminent, but she wasn't ready to let Leonard die without a fight. She raced to the prison, pushing for a final meeting between Leonard and his dog, Eclipse, his one remaining tie to the life they once shared. If this was the end, she wanted to make sure Leonard had something, anything, that would give him a sense of peace. At the prison, the stakes were high. Helen arrived with Eclipse in tow, determined to fulfill Leonard's final wish. Against all odds, the warden, Mara Batista, approved the request, allowing them to bring the dog into Leonard's holding cell for one last, bittersweet reunion. As the dog bounded into the room, tail wagging furiously, Leonard's face lit up with a mixture of joy and sorrow. For a few precious minutes, everything else faded away, and Leonard was no longer a condemned man. He was simply a man with his dog, sharing a moment of love and connection before everything was taken from him. But even as Leonard and Eclipse shared their final moments together, the world outside was changing. Delacroix's investigation was making waves, and the evidence pointing to Green was undeniable. As the clock ticked down to Leonard's execution, Delacroix was pushing the authorities for a last-minute delay. He couldn't bear the thought of Leonard dying for a crime he didn't commit, and with the new evidence in hand, he wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. Stay tuned to find out whether Leonard Jackson will be saved by the truth, or if it will be too late for justice to prevail. The battle for his life is far from over, and in these final moments, anything could happen. As the day of Leonard Jackson's scheduled execution drew closer, a sense of hopelessness had begun to take over. For 5 long years, he had sat in a cold, isolated cell, fighting for a justice that never seemed to come. His conviction was final. His fate had been sealed. And yet in the final moments, a shocking turn of events unfolded, turning everything upside down. Detective Anton Delacroix, the very man who had helped put Leonard on death row, had begun to unravel a chilling truth. For years, he had stood by his conviction, certain that Leonard was guilty. But as time went on, something didn't sit right with Delacroix. Details from the investigation, once seen as solid evidence, began to feel suspicious. New questions surfaced, unanswered leads, suppressed reports, and strange inconsistencies that didn't add up. It wasn't until just days before Leonard's execution that Delacroix found something that could change everything. A second forensic report had been buried, never presented during the trial, and it contained explosive information that pointed to a major flaw in the case. This report, which had been intentionally withheld, indicated that the evidence was tampered with. But that wasn't all. New phone records revealed that a suspect named Walton Green, a notorious fixer with ties to powerful people, had been in the area on the night of Raymond Concade's murder. Green had never been mentioned during the trial, and this discovery could prove that Leonard was framed. With this new evidence in hand, Delacroix knew he had to act quickly. Leonard's execution was just hours away, and every minute counted. He reached out to the prison, desperately trying to get them to stop the process, to give him just enough time to present the new findings. He couldn't undo the years of injustice, but he could at least try to save Leonard from death. However, the prison system was slow to respond, and time was slipping away fast. Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, refused to give up. She had been by his side from the beginning, believing in his innocence even when everyone else turned their back on him. As the day of execution loomed, Helen clung to the hope that somehow, against all odds, justice would prevail. She fought for Leonard's final wish, to see his dog, Eclipse, one last time. Despite the strict rules and the looming deadline, Helen wasn't willing to give up. She brought Eclipse to the prison, determined to give Leonard this final moment of peace. Inside the prison, the tension was palpable. Leonard stood, shackled and broken, waiting for what he thought would be his final hours. But as the minutes ticked away, a phone call came through. A phone call that would change everything. The warden, Mara Batista, had received the new evidence. She was willing to delay the execution for 2 hours to verify the claims. For the first time in years, Leonard allowed himself to hope. As Delacroix worked to present the new findings, Leonard's reunion with Eclipse provided a small, bittersweet moment of comfort. The German shepherd bounded into his cell, tail wagging with excitement, as if to remind him that not all was lost. In those precious moments with his dog, Leonard found something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Stay tuned to see whether Leonard Jackson's fight for justice will finally be heard, and whether this last-minute twist will save him from an unjust death sentence. The truth is coming to light, but will it be enough to save a man who has already lost so much? As the hours dwindled before Leonard Jackson's execution, hope seemed like a fleeting dream. He had been wrongfully convicted, sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit, and for 5 years his pleas of innocence had fallen on deaf ears. But as the clock ticked down, a twist of fate was about to rewrite his story. In a stunning turn of events, Detective Anton Delacroix, the man who had once led the investigation that convicted Leonard, began to question everything. The case that had seemed so solid now appeared full of cracks. Evidence that was once regarded as indisputable now seemed manipulated. Delacroix, haunted by years of doubt and the weight of his role in Leonard's fate, began digging into the case he had helped build. He uncovered startling truths, evidence that had been withheld, new witnesses who had never been heard, and a pattern of questionable decisions that pointed to one undeniable conclusion: Leonard had been framed. But it wasn't just Delacroix's doubts that would change the course of Leonard's fate. New damning evidence emerged just in time. A previously overlooked phone log revealed that Walton Green, a notorious fixer with ties to dangerous people, had been in the area on the night of the murder. Green's name had never appeared during the trial, but his presence near the crime scene was enough to cast serious doubt on Leonard's conviction. Dell'Oqua was certain now. Leonard was innocent. But time was running out. With the execution scheduled to take place in just hours, the clock was ticking down. Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, had never stopped believing in him. Despite the years of being told that he was guilty, she knew in her heart that Leonard was innocent. As the day of his execution arrived, she was determined to do whatever it took to get his last wish fulfilled, to see his dog, Eclipse, one final time. For years, Eclipse had been more than just a pet to Leonard. He had been his lifeline, his companion through the darkest moments. Helen knew this small act of kindness, this final reunion, could offer Leonard a moment of peace in his final hours. Against all odds, the warden approved the request, and Helen rushed to the prison with Eclipse in tow. When Leonard saw his beloved dog, all the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Eclipse's tail wagged furiously as he bounded toward Leonard, eager to reconnect with the man who had once been his whole world. For a few precious minutes, Leonard was no longer a man on death row. He was simply a man reunited with his dog, feeling the unconditional love and loyalty that had always been there. But as the reunion ended, the fight for justice was far from over. Dell'Oqua's frantic push for the truth was beginning to gain traction. He had submitted the new evidence to the authorities, hoping for a miracle. And just as time was about to run out, the unthinkable happened. The execution was delayed. The warden, acting on the newly uncovered evidence, had secured a 2-hour postponement to investigate further. For the first time in years, Leonard allowed himself to hope again. As the minutes ticked down, Leonard's fate hung in the balance. Would this last-minute twist be enough to save him, or was the system too broken to correct its mistakes in time? Stay tuned to find out how Leonard's fight for justice unfolds in these final, heart-pounding moments. The truth is emerging, but will it be enough to stop an unjust execution? As Leonard Jackson's execution time neared, the world around him seemed to close in. For 5 long years, he had sat behind bars, wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And now, with just hours remaining, there was little hope left. But in a stunning twist, the truth was about to break free, just in the nick of time. Detective Anton Dell'Oqua, who had once led the investigation that convicted Leonard, had been living with his own guilt for years. The evidence that had once seemed irrefutable now appeared suspicious, even fabricated. Dell'Oqua could no longer ignore the signs that something was terribly wrong. His doubts had been growing, gnawing at him, until he could no longer stand by in silence. The more he dug into Leonard's case, the more inconsistencies he uncovered, crucial evidence that had been conveniently hidden, key witnesses who had never been heard, and the horrifying realization that Leonard had been framed. In a desperate bid to save the life of an innocent man, Dell'Oqua reached out to his trusted contact in digital forensics. Time was running out, and he needed answers fast. Within hours, they discovered a bombshell. Walton Green, a shady fixer with ties to powerful criminals, had been in the area on the night of the murder. This discovery was crucial. Green's involvement had never been investigated, but now it was clear that he was a key player in the case, and his name had been deliberately kept out of the trial. Dell'Oqua knew that this new evidence could be the key to saving Leonard, but he also knew that the window for action was closing rapidly. Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, had been his unwavering support throughout these hellish years. She never stopped believing in his innocence. Even as the day of execution approached, she fought for Leonard's final wish, to see his beloved dog Eclipse one last time. Despite the prison's strict regulations and the looming threat of death, Helen didn't back down. She drove to the prison with Eclipse, hoping against hope that the warden would grant Leonard this one last moment of peace. The dog, who had once been a symbol of the life Leonard had lost, was the only connection to that past life he had left. The warden, Mara Batista, had always been strict, but in the face of Leonard's request, she showed a surprising amount of compassion. She approved the final meeting between Leonard and Eclipse. When the dog entered the cell, the transformation was immediate. The sterile, cold air in the room seemed to melt away as Eclipse bounded toward Leonard, tail wagging, joy radiating from the animal. For a brief, fleeting moment, Leonard was no longer the man condemned to die. He was simply a man with his dog, sharing a moment of pure love and affection before the inevitable. But even as Leonard clung to this final moment of peace, The fight for his life was far from over. Delocua was making a last-ditch effort to present the new evidence, pushing to have the execution delayed. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like a lifetime. With the warden now aware of the new evidence, Delocua's persistence was paying off. Leonard's execution was temporarily postponed, just long enough to allow time for a full review of the evidence. Now the question remained, would this new evidence be enough to prove Leonard's innocence, or was it too late? As the hours passed, the possibility of justice grew stronger. For the first time in years, Leonard allowed himself to believe that he might have a future. But would the system finally correct its mistakes before it was too late? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Will Leonard Jackson be exonerated, or will time run out before the truth can save him? The fight for his life is far from over, and in these final moments, anything could happen. As Leonard Jackson sat on death row, the moments before his scheduled execution weighed heavily on him. The past 5 years had been a blur of failed appeals, dead ends, and heartache. He had insisted on his innocence from day one, but the world had turned a deaf ear. Now, with the execution scheduled for the morning, all seemed lost. But little did Leonard know, an unexpected twist was about to unfold, giving him one last chance at justice. Detective Anton Delocua, the man who had led the investigation that sentenced Leonard to death, had been wrestling with his conscience for months. The case that had once seemed open and shut was now riddled with doubt. Delocua had seen the inconsistencies, the missing evidence, and the unanswered questions that painted a picture of a flawed investigation. For years, he had dismissed these doubts, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. But now, as Leonard's execution date loomed, those doubts couldn't be ignored any longer. Delacua knew that he had to act fast. He reached out to a trusted contact in digital forensics, hoping that the answers they needed could be found in time. Hours before Leonard's execution, they uncovered something shocking. Walton Green, a fixer with ties to dangerous people, had been in the area on the night of the murder. Green's name had never come up in the trial, but new evidence pointed to him as a key player in the crime. This discovery was a game-changer, and Delocua knew it was the key to stopping the execution. But as the clock ticked down, Delocua found himself fighting against a system that was determined to carry out the death sentence. He had only hours to present the new evidence and convince the authorities to stop the execution. It was a race against time, and every second counted. Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, was desperately trying to get his final wish granted: to see his dog, Eclipse, one last time. For Leonard, Eclipse represented the life he once had, and seeing the dog before his death would give him some semblance of peace. Helen fought tooth and nail with the warden, Mara Batista, to allow Eclipse to be brought into the prison for a final visit. Despite the prison's strict policies, the warden finally relented, and Helen rushed to the prison with Eclipse in tow. When Leonard saw his dog, something inside him shifted. The connection between man and animal was undeniable, and in that moment, Leonard felt a glimmer of hope. Even in the face of death, the love between him and Eclipse was unwavering. As the reunion between Leonard and Eclipse unfolded, Delocua was working tirelessly to present the new evidence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the warden granted a 2-hour delay in the execution to investigate the new findings. For the first time in years, Leonard allowed himself to believe that justice might be within reach. But would it be enough? With just hours to spare, Delacua and Helen raced against the clock to ensure that Leonard's innocence would finally be recognized. Stay tuned to find out if Leonard Jackson's fight for justice is finally won, or if the system will fail him once again. The battle for his life is far from over, and the stakes have never been higher. As Leonard Jackson's execution time drew near, it seemed like the end was inevitable. For 5 years, Leonard had languished in prison, wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and now the moment he had feared was finally within reach. The clock was ticking down to his final hours, and despite his constant pleas of innocence, nothing had changed. He had accepted his fate, until one small but crucial breakthrough gave him a glimmer of hope. Detective Anton Delocua, the man responsible for leading the investigation that convicted Leonard, had been carrying the heavy burden of doubt for years. The case, once seen as a straightforward conviction, had started to unravel in Delocua's mind. Evidence that was once thought to be solid now appeared deeply flawed. Key pieces of information had been ignored, while other crucial details were conveniently dismissed. As Leonard's execution loomed, DeLoca could no longer stand by. His conscience was eating at him, and he decided to dig deeper into the case, determined to find something, anything, that could save Leonard's life. In a desperate effort to uncover the truth, DeLoca reached out to a contact in digital forensics, someone he trusted to dig through the details that had been buried for too long. The results were nothing short of shocking. New evidence surfaced, a phone log revealing that Walton Green, a fixer with ties to powerful figures, had been in the area the night Raymond Concade was murdered. Green's involvement had never been considered during the trial, but now it seemed to fit perfectly with the gaps in the original investigation. This could be the key to unraveling the case and proving Leonard's innocence. But time was running out. Leonard's execution was only hours away, and DeLoca knew he had a narrow window to present this new evidence to the authorities. He desperately contacted the prison, hoping for a last-minute delay, but the system was reluctant to act quickly. Meanwhile, Helen Griggs, Leonard's fiancée, was not about to give up. She had been by his side throughout the entire ordeal, always believing in his innocence, even when the world refused to listen. Now, with Leonard's life on the line, she fought tooth and nail to fulfill his final wish, to see his dog, Eclipse, one last time. Helen knew that this simple request, a final reunion between Leonard and his loyal companion, could offer him a moment of peace before the inevitable. She pushed for the warden's approval to bring Eclipse into the prison, even though the rules were strict. Surprisingly, the warden agreed, allowing them this one final moment. As Helen entered the prison with Eclipse by her side, Leonard's heart filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Seeing his dog again was like a brief, shining light in the darkness. For a few moments, he was no longer a man on death row. He was simply a man with his dog, sharing a bond that had survived everything. But even as Leonard's final moments with Eclipse unfolded, the battle for his life was far from over. DeLoca was still working tirelessly to get the new evidence reviewed before the execution could proceed. With only hours left, he continued to fight for Leonard's right to be heard. And just as the clock was about to strike, a miracle happened. The execution was delayed for 2 hours, giving DeLoca the time he needed to present the new findings. For the first time in years, Leonard allowed himself to hope. Could this new evidence be enough to prove his innocence? Could justice finally prevail, or was it too late for redemption? Stay tuned to find out what happens in the final moments of Leonard Jackson's battle for his life. The truth is coming to light, but will it be enough to save him? As Leonard Jackson's execution neared, it seemed like there was no hope left. For 5 years he had maintained his innocence, but the world had refused to listen. His time was running out, until a shocking twist turned everything upside down. Detective Anton DeLoca, the same man who had led the investigation that convicted Leonard, began to have serious doubts. What seemed like solid evidence now appeared to be flawed, and buried within the case was a new discovery that could change everything. With the execution scheduled for just hours away, DeLoca took a desperate step to uncover the truth. New evidence pointed to a mysterious figure, Walton Green, who had been in the area the night of the murder, something that had never been considered before. With this breakthrough, DeLoca rushed to the authorities, hoping to stop the execution in time. Meanwhile, Leonard's fiancée, Helen, fought for his final wish, to see his dog, Eclipse, one last time. Against all odds, the warden granted Leonard's request, and for a brief moment, Leonard was reunited with his loyal dog. As the clock ticked down, the fight for justice had never felt so urgent. Would it be enough to save him? Stay tuned to find out.